Hello and welcome back. Now we're getting to the heart of this course, which is story structure. That's what really trips up a lot of beginning writers, but it's so simple that once you know it, you'll be able to do it intuitively, and it'll make all of your novel writing just so much easier and more pleasurable. We're going to begin by looking at the classic story structure of the three-act structure, which is what Greek plays thousands of years ago were using, and it still works just as well today. And this diagram shows how any play can be divided into three acts with rising action through the first and the second act until you reach a climax somewhere in the third act, and then a moment of what's called catharsis, that is the payoff, the relaxation, the ah feeling we get when the good guy wins, and the wrap-up at the end. And so your novel will probably follow this same process because it's a great way to introduce a character, put her through a lot of turmoil, throw problems at her, have her change, solve the problems, and then get that payoff at the end with success. Students often asked me, are the three acts the same length? And they don't have to be at all. In fact, in extreme cases, the first act or the last act could even be a page long, maybe even less. But those are extreme cases. Usually, we need a few pages, dozens of pages, maybe 100 pages to really get into the action, to figure out what's going on, and to develop some sympathy for the main character. So that's typically Act 1. Then in Act 2, a whole bunch of stuff goes wrong, one thing after another. All of these obstacles are thrown at the character, and she has to deal with them, and her situation seems to be getting worse and worse and worse until usually at the end of Act 2 there's this sort of black moment that things are just as bad as they can get, until finally she makes a realization. And we'll talk about what that realization is when we break this down into the individual checkpoints of story structuring. But after that realization, she's a changed person, and now she can solve her problem. So she goes, she faces the antagonist, and that's the climax. That's the peak of that action, the payoff, where she triumphs, and then things are wrapped up after that. And so it really is true that most stories have similar structures. And if you think about television shows, movies, and novels that you've read, I think you'll find it's hard to come up with an example that doesn't actually follow that structure. And now I'm going to introduce in short order what we're going to explore for the next 3 lessons, which are my checkpoints of story structure. I've broken the 3 acts into 3 checkpoints apiece that make it very, very easy for you to structure your own novel. And so let's look at this more detailed diagram of the 3 acts and how I would draw the rising action and how I would label the 9 checkpoints within those 3 acts. In the first act, your first job is to hook readers in, and so I call that the hook. This just gets them interested. And once they're interested, you kind of need to tell them what's going on, because often we sort of start in media res, which means in the middle of the action, and now it's time to back off a bit and say, well, what the heck is going on here? I call that section the backstory section because it usually contains quite a bit of backstory. This is where we learn who your character is, how they got to this spot, and what they're trying to do. And now we really need to create some really spectacular action that will trigger a crisis within your character. So this is a direct attack on your character's flaw, typically, and so I call it the trigger, and it results in the crisis. So the trigger closes Act 1, and the crisis begins Act 2. And now that she's in crisis, your protagonist is going to go through more and more setbacks, and so the rising action ratchets itself up. But I use the word ratchet because you can't just assail your readers with bad thing after bad thing after bad thing. You'll tire them out by the middle of Act 2, because Act 2, as you can see, is usually the longest act in the book. So we need to give them a little respite, and that's what a ratchet does, is that it elevates things and then it takes it back a little bit, elevates it some more, takes it back a little bit. And so the struggle is the long middle section of Act 2, and that's where your protagonist keeps getting into more and more hot water until finally, at the end of Act 2, she realizes what's wrong with her. She realizes the thing we've seen all along. She realizes her flaw. She had this flaw since the very beginning of the novel, but she probably didn't see it. For example, if she lacked confidence, she did all these things that an unconfident person would do, but she never stopped for a moment like she does in the Epiphany and thought to herself, wow, I have lacked confidence in myself, and I'm never going to get anywhere unless I believe in myself. That's the moment of Epiphany. That's the turning point of the novel. And that Epiphany checkpoint allows us to now enter Act 3. And in Act 3, she can do something she couldn't do before. She can make a plan that may or may not work, but at least it's a plan. And so now, with that plan or multiple plans, eventually she comes into confrontation with the antagonist. And that occurs in the climax. And the climax is where the antagonist is defeated by his own flaw. He can't change the way that she did. He can't overcome it. So if he was overconfident, he's still overconfident. And as a result of that overconfidence, he does something stupid in response to her actions, to her plan, and he is defeated. And then we wrap things up in an ending where presumably everyone lives happily ever after. Now, there's one other twist on this, and that is, what if we're writing a tragedy? Now, a tragedy doesn't mean something with an unhappy ending, as you might expect, because it's possible for the scenario that I just described to play out and something bad to still happen. She could have come up with a plan, it could work, it could defeat the antagonist, but unexpected events might also cause bad things to happen to her. Or perhaps the defeat of the antagonist has some side effects. Or perhaps in the end she decides she didn't really want to defeat him that much. Those are unhappy endings, but those are not tragedies. A tragedy is something very specific. A tragedy is a story where the protagonist fails to overcome her flaw. And it still follows these same checkpoints, but because the spot for the epiphany is not filled with, oh, I realize what's wrong with myself. Instead, it's filled with the opportunity for her to realize it, but she fails to. And so because she fails to realize that flaw, she's unable to make a plan or unable to make a plan that works. As a result, when the confrontation with the antagonist occurs, she is unsuccessful. Even though the antagonist didn't change either, he prevails. That's a tragedy. It's also possible to write a tragedy. You can argue whether readers really like to read tragedies. They're more satisfied, I think, if the protagonist actually changes but then fails due to circumstances beyond their control and you have an unhappy ending, as opposed to them just not changing. That can be frustrating because if we've spent the entire book knowing what's wrong with the protagonist, but the protagonist never figures it out herself, at the end of the book we may wonder, why did I spend all that time on this character that didn't ever really get it? So be careful in writing a true tragedy. You need to have very compelling reasons to do it. But if you want unhappy things to happen, there's lots of genres where that's common. Go for it. So, in our next lesson, we're going to turn our attention in detail to each of the 3 acts, 1 act per lesson, and we'll discuss what's in each of those acts' 3 checkpoints in detail. As we do that, you'll have test drives where you'll be able to fill in for your own novel what goes into those checkpoints, and by the end of those 3 lessons, you will have a really great map for your novel. So I'll see you there.